By now the people of Israel must hate him bitterly. Now he will have to stay here and serve him forever. And the next reading, we're skipping a chapter and then going to chapter 29. The entire Philistine army now mobilized at Aphek, and the Israelites camped at the spring of Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers were leading out their troops in groups of 101,000, David and his men marched at the rear with King Kish. But the Philistine commanders demanded, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish told them, "This is David, the man who ran away from King Saul of Israel. He's been with me for years, and I've never found a single fault in him since he defected to me." But the Philistine commanders were angry. "Send him back," they demanded. "He can't go into battle with us. What if he turns against us? Is there any better way for him to reconcile himself with his master than by turning on us in battle? Isn't this the same David about whom the women of Israel sing in their dances? Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. So Achish finally summoned David and his men. "I swear by the Lord," he told them, "you are some of the finest men I have ever met. I think you should go with us, but the other Philistine rulers won't hear of it. Please don't upset them. Go back quietly." "What have I done to deserve this treatment?" David demanded. "Why can't I fight the enemies of my lord the king?" But Achish insisted, "As far as I'm concerned, you're as perfect as an angel of God, but my commanders are afraid to have you with them in battle. Now get up early in the morning, leave with your men as soon as it gets light." So David headed back into the land of the Philistines, while the Philistine army on to Jezreel.
Tricky. It'll be helpful to have 1 Samuel 27 open. Let me just do that myself. What do you prefer? A mirror or a filter? It's the world of phones and doctored images. Even I can look beautiful on a picture. You just got to filter. You've just got to kind of filter out the bad, highlight the good. I particularly like the Instagram filter called Clarendon. Just makes me pop. I look so great. Well, I look better. What do you prefer? Do you prefer the filtered view or the mirror? A good mirror shines back and says, this is who you are. This is what you really look like. When you think of the Bible, what do you think of? Is it a filter or a mirror? Is it presenting us a filtered view, hiding the flaws, highlighting the good bits? Or is it a mirror? Is it realistic about life? Is it realistic about humanity? Is it realistic about our failings? I put it to you that actually the Bible is a mirror. It offers the unfiltered view of humanity. It's actually one of the reasons I trust the Bible. It presents the key characters, even the heroes of the Bible, as they really were. It tells us who they are in their successes and failures. And we see that they're wonderfully made, but fatally flawed. Except, of course, the true great hero, Jesus. But a lot of people then come to the Bible, though, and they find that a reason to condemn the Bible because they assume it's a book of hero worship. They assume that it's going to show us what's great about humanity. And they can't stand it. But the Bible is a mirror. And so the reason that matters is we're going to see this picture of David, who's the great hero of Israel, one of the greatest characters of the whole Bible, the great saving Messiah of the Old Testament story that points us to Jesus, the saving Messiah. And yet, the next few chapters are filled with deep ambiguity because it's the unfiltered view of humanity. Let's step into it. Despair. Verse 1, David said to himself, "One of these days I'll be swept away by Saul. There is nothing better for me than to escape immediately to the land of the Philistines." At the start of chapter 27, this verse actually comes as a surprise because we've seen in the previous close encounters between David and Saul, David seemed resolute in his confidence that the Lord would save him. It seems he had this deep trust in the Lord's protection. But now it seems perhaps that fear and despair have gripped his heart. Hear it in that language. One of these days, I will be swept away by Saul. And remember, Saul's mobilized the whole army of Israel to hunt for David and his few men. So David with his 600 men and all their families go to the land of the Philistines, and David's 2 wives come. Verse 4, when it was reported to Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. Now, interesting though, what's interesting is again the parallels between David and Jesus, just a small one here. When Jesus is hunted by the authorities and they're searching for him, where does he go? He crosses the Sea of Galilee and goes into the nations of the Gentiles, into the Decapolis, the 10 cities of the Gentiles. Interesting parallel, though Jesus doesn't go out of despair. Just interesting. Again, David's pointing us to Jesus. But where? Well, away from the centre. A conversation unfolds in verses 5 to 7 with Achish, who, David had appeared before him as insane a few chapters earlier. And Achish has a conversation. David has a conversation with Achish and says, "Look, let me stay out of the city. Let me stay in one of the small towns." And Achish gives David the city or village of Ziklag. And it's pretty interesting there. Again, just this little historical note that we don't know when exactly 1 Samuel's written. It's written sometime after these events, but it sees itself as historical because look at what it notes. Ziklag still belongs to the kings of Judah to this day. Why is that weird? Well, because when 1 Samuel is written up, the land still obviously belongs to the Philistines or not Israel, except for Ziklag. And you kind of go, why do we Israelites hold that little bit of land over there? Do you know, like the city of Calais in France? People know about the city of Calais in France? From the 1350s to the 1550s, England held that piece of land as the closest piece of land between England and France. They conquered the city of Calais. So for 200 years, Calais in France was part of England. And so you get actually in some of the kind of stories and you're like, why? What's going on? And unless you know that there's this little outpost that the English conquered. They lost it to the Spanish and then Napoleon took it from the Spanish and they lost it. But that's why Calais was an English province in France. It's a little bit like that. Ziklag is this territory that even when 1 Samuel is written is off in the province. So just a little kind of historical note. Either the Old Testament is the most brilliant historical myth-writing fiction, even before that genre ever existed. That's one option. Or it is what it says it is, historical narrative with a theological purpose. But notice if you decide that it's brilliant, deceptive, historical myth-writing, that's still pretty incredible. You're still kind of saying these guys were really smart. You might not really want to go down that path. All right, Ziklag. Sidebar. What happens? Well, deceptive David. David and his men went up and raided the Gershurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, they've been the inhabitants of the region through Shur as far as the land of Egypt. When David attacked the land, he did not leave a single person alive, either man or woman, but he took flocks, herds, donkeys, and camels. But then when Achish asked David what he's been up to, David says something else. You notice that in the next verse? He says he's raiding in the south country of Judah. So what is he doing? He's not attacking in the land of the Philistines, but he's attacking kind of further south and further to the west. And it's the Amalekites, who are the enemies of God's people. It's hard to know about the Gerishites and the Girzites. We don't have any other historical information. But it seems like it is part of the land that the Israelites were supposed to conquer. But it's Joshua 13, the Girzites are mentioned as some of the Canaanite people that the Israelites were supposed to drive out. But it does leave us with a difficult question. Because why does David kill those people? It's brutal. It doesn't say because the Lord commanded it. It doesn't reference the instructions to Joshua. What does it reference? David protecting himself. David keeping the lie. David destroying these people so that no one can go back to Achish and say, hey, by the way, David's actually making war down in Egypt. But also, why is David taking on the practices of the Philistines? The Philistines raided other cities. So instead of growing their own land and building their own wealth, that was a Philistine practice to kind of gain wealth and gain land by constant war. What is David doing, taking up the practice of the Philistines? See, there's something a bit ominous in this. Let me put it to you like this. David is killing and then lying to cover up the killing for self-protection. Does it remind you of anything? It ought to. And now the question in this is, what Achish, how did he become a king? Is it always true that people rise to the level of their incompetence? How could he be deceived again? Like, my goodness. And look what Achish says, verse 12. He trusted David. He says, since he has made himself repulsive to his people Israel, he will be my servant forever. Achish, what an idiot. And yet, if you feel a little bit smug about Achish's stupidity, just pause. Do people believe something because they want it to be true? How often do people do that? All the time. All the time. We've even got a name for it. Confirmation bias. Achish is just like us. This is an unfiltered view. It's a mirror holding up to us to show us who we are as people. David in his deception, his self-protection. The ambiguity. Is he doing this to fulfill the word of God? But why is he raiding? He's not doing this as the king. He's not yet the king. And what about Achish? And it seems like David's craftiness and cunning kind of traps him. Chapter 28. At that time, and we read the rest of this chapter last week, at that time the Philistines gathered their military units into one army to fight against Israel. So Achish said to David, you know, of course, that you and your men must march out in the army with me. Now, when you first read that, you might think, maybe Achish is a bit afraid to leave 600 men back, part of the Israelites. But actually, no, Achish is completely sold on David. David replied to Achish, good, you will find out what your servant can do. And Achish said to him, very well, I will appoint you as my permanent bodyguard. That is, David and his men will be the crack troops who keep the king safe. They are going to defend Achish. You're like, really? Isn't it the same David that killed Goliath of Gath, part of Achish's kingdom? but it's kind of ominous. It looks like David and his men will go to war against Israel. What's going on? Is Achish really that thick? Or is David really much more crafty and cunning than we often think of him as? Is he actually, deceptive is the negative word, crafty and cunning is the positive thing. But those two things are the same coin, really, aren't they? And is David really going to go to march against Israel? Has the despair in chapter 27 gripped him so tightly that he's actually going to take up arms against Saul and the Philistines? Take up arms against Saul with the Philistines, Or is David just caught up in circumstances he can't control? These questions are left hanging then as actually we enter into the story of Saul and the witch of Endor from last week. And we hear the story of Saul and Endor. And at the end of that chapter 28, we hear that the kingship of Saul is ending. And he will die. And his sons will die by the hand of the Philistines. And so chapter 28 ends again with more questions. Is this because David will now fight with the Philistines and conquer Saul finally? But is that right and good? David, who never would raise his hand against Saul, is now going to do that? Again, it's full of ambiguity. Isn't that an unfiltered view of our life and our choices and our decisions? We make decisions, we think they're right, we get caught up in circumstances we can't control. And yet there's good news. God protects his Messiah. Chapter 29. God protects his Messiah. So the Philistines bring all their military units together and they're reviewing them. And these events are unfolding as Saul is basically traveling and sorting out the witch of Endor and going to see him. And David and his men, they march at the end of this review parade. And the Philistine commanders ask in verse 1, what are these Hebrews doing in the army? Achish, this is David, servant of King Saul. He's been with me a considerable period of time, about 18 months. From the day he defected until now, I have found no fault in him. That's verse 3. And the Philistine commanders are like, Achish, are you nuts? What do you think is going to happen during the battle? Who do you think David will fight for? He and his men will fight for Saul. They'll turn tables. Achish, you're an idiot. Don't you remember the song they sang about David? Saul has killed his thousands of Philistines. And David, his tens of thousands. And so Achish summons David, verse 6. And it seems here, Achish, I think he's just wanting to use language that David would understand. I don't think he actually honours Yahweh. And more deception. As the Lord lives, David, you are an honourable man. I think it is good to have you fighting in this unit with me, because I have found no fault in you from the day you came to me until today. But the leaders don't think you're reliable. Now go back quietly. You won't be doing anything the Philistine leaders think is wrong. Again, it's all deeply ambiguous. 3 times Achish says David is good or honourable. Verses 3, verse 6, verse 9. But think about David. Has David been telling the truth to Achish? Has he been honourable to Achish? No, he's been honourable to Israel. He's not raised his hand against Israel or against Saul. He's been killing the enemies of Israel, probably. But it seems deeply ambiguous. It looks like David's offended, verse 8. Or perhaps he's just being cunning. But what have I done? David replied to Achish. From the first day I entered your service until now, what have you found against your servant to keep me from going to fight against the enemies of my Lord the King? But again, it's all deeply ambiguous. Is David Achish's servant? Not at all. He's been fighting. He hasn't been raiding Israel. We know he's not Achish's servant. And the title there, against the enemies of my Lord and my King, Well, the last time we heard that exact phrase was when David used it about Saul, my Lord and my King. The enemies of my Lord and my King. Has he got a plot and a plan that he wants to march out with the Philistines and then he'll turn against them? Is he offended? Is he just cunning? But Achish is fooled either way. Verse 9, I'm convinced that you are as reliable as an angel of God. But the rest of the team, the Philistine commanders, they say, you're on the bench, buddy. So head back. You've got to go. Head back to Ziklag. God's not mentioned here at all. In all of these sections on David, God is not mentioned at all. But I think this is God's intervention to protect his Messiah. See, David then, in the coming chapters, when Saul falls to the hands of the Philistines that we know as promised, where is David? Far away and innocent. But it's still deeply ambiguous. Has David risen up against Saul? Well, no. But is he deceptive? Yes. Is he brutal? Yes. Is he in the right? Probably not. Oh, I missed that one. See, a good mirror shows things as they are. The Bible here is actually holding a mirror up to us. We are deeply flawed. Even the heroes of the Bible are deeply flawed. David, it's hard to know. I think he seems to have lost his way, that the despair that grips him at the start of chapter 27 actually kind of is shaping his decisions. The commentary I read argued no, that David is keeping his integrity. I'm not so sure. David, a brilliant military commander, a great tactician, capable, but crafty and cunning, deceptive, a liar, and a brutal killer. We would prefer a filtered view, wouldn't we? We would prefer this story to not be there about David. We prefer for this hero to be comfortable. We can embrace him entirely. But the Bible wants to hold up to us and to humanity a mirror. This is who we are. This is what we are like. And that even the greatest of us, and for King David was indeed great, he's far more intelligent, skilled, charismatic, able to lead than any of us. He was greater than all of us. And yet, he was fundamentally flawed and sinful. See, the greatest of us is fundamentally flawed. How do you look at yourself? Through a filter? Do you hide from yourself your moments of weakness and deception? Haven't you deceived yourself like Achish, but not recognized it? I know I have. Haven't you deceived others like David, but justify it as a white lie? I needed to do it for self-protection. Haven't you, at times, thought and acted brutally towards others because you could? That's the unfiltered view of us. So what hope is there for humanity? None. There is no hope for humanity from within us, which is why God had to act to save us. to bring the Messiah, David's greater son. That's why Jesus came. That's why God was incarnate and took on flesh. To save humanity, because we could not save ourselves. No one from within us could save us. But what else do you see in Jesus? Well, he is the unfiltered view of God. We must look to him. Let me pray. We'll open up for a quick question and comment time. Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, help us come to grips with this unfiltered view of David, but also an unfiltered view of what we are like. Prone to self-deception, prone to deceiving others, and guilty of brutality. Father, help us see these things and see them truly, so that we might truly see our need for Jesus, the true hero of humanity, the holy, perfect, righteous one, who never despaired, who never deceived, who never acted with brutality, but was perfectly gentle, even when it meant his death. Father, thank you for Jesus and the wonderful, unfiltered view he gives us of who you are.